Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 4 in the Sullivan textbook. We're going to be going over kind of the reflective clinical supervision model, what it looks like, how it's presented. We've seen this in the Glickman text already, but this at least gives it a different perspective and paints a different light to it that I think is going to be beneficial to all of you. The idea that I think makes the Sullivan text different from the Glickman text, even though I love the Glickman text, the Sullivan text really engages this idea that clinical supervision, you adapt to it, and it really ties into the adaptive leadership concept that we've been talking about in leadership theory. I think that's important, but it builds on the other model that we've already discussed, so you should at least see some continuity and parallelism between the models. Clinical supervision, if we look at it as the way the Page Act describes it, it's this idea that people, when they're supervised, are open to change and assistance from others. And then that they know on their own what they can do to make those necessary changes. It's important that teachers are reflective in what they do, and if they're not reflective, that's going to be a problem in understanding whether or not the model works or it doesn't work. So we give you the 9, as I normally do, the 9 major characteristics for clinical supervision. I'll leave this up on here for about a minute or so, just so you can get a look at it, and I will purposely leave the room, go grab a drink, and come back. That way you can read them, and then we're going to talk about each one of these a little bit in depth. All right, I'm back. I grabbed a Pepsi. Hopefully you had a chance to read the 9 strategies, and as I normally do, I'll go in depth into each one of these. So the first thing that we need to know is that clinical supervision has to be used to improve instruction. If it doesn't improve instruction, then it's completely ineffective. It shouldn't be done as a gotcha thing. It has to be done to say, if you do A, B, and C in your classroom, teaching is going to get better. It can't be used for punishment, but that's easier said than done. We've spent at least a third of this class talking about how not to use the clinical supervision model as punishment, so that should tell you, as somebody watching this video, that it's done in schools, and people know that that happens. And until we change that model and change that perception, nothing is ever going to be good. A deliberate intervention into the instructional process, it's supposed to give the teacher feedback to get better. It shouldn't be the final observation and the final thing that says whether or not the person is a good teacher. This is why I've been stressing throughout this course it's formative and not summative. Goal-oriented, it contributes to the school needs with the goals of the teacher. That's big, and that's another big idea. It shouldn't just be used for school compliance, but it should be used to improve the goals of the teacher as well. It has to have appropriate planning and support from both the teacher and supervisor. And as I've said throughout this entire class, they have to be on the same page. If the teacher and the supervisor aren't on the same page as to what the model is going to be used for, then you've accomplished nothing. It's why we're going through the Catcher book and really looking at teacher walkthroughs is an empowering mechanism, but also we're looking at it as something that can be used to improve the process as a whole. There has to be a positive relationship between the teacher and supervisor going into the supervision model. A lot of principals will want to supervise the teachers they hate the most because they want to catch them in a gotcha moment. But if you have somebody who's actually positive and who's there to help, this creates a better opportunity, it creates a better professional environment, and we don't want it to just be a formal summative observation. Once again, as I keep repeating, this is also easier said than done. There has to be mutual trust and mutual help. The supervisor is there to help improve instruction. If the teacher feels like the supervisor is going to attack them, then they're not going to teach as well. And you're going to be assessing something that doesn't need to be assessed. The supervisor has to trust that the teacher isn't presenting a fake lesson, and using that as their actual snapshot of the lesson is not a fair way to account for supervision process as a whole. The model is non-flexible, and to me, that's kind of an issue. When you have a form that you have to fill out, you can't be flexible with each form. But all teachers teach differently. All subject areas are differently. I could go into an early childhood classroom and work with kindergartners and first graders and had a better idea of math instruction there than I would say. I mean, I'm probably arrogant of me to say this, but I would put myself in one of the top 0.001% going into those classrooms and knowing what the teacher should know and how students learn. I had no clue when I started in early childhood on what effective reading instruction looked like. I was a math and technology guy, and I knew it well, and I knew what needed to be done in the elementary schools, and I still do. But I had to learn when I was writing my supervision reports that if I was watching a reading lesson, how I assess it, I had to be flexible. And the forms didn't let me be flexible. And when a form doesn't let you be flexible, that is a huge freaking problem, because then you have to just fill into whatever the form is telling you to fill in. There's always a gap between what a supervision looks like and what it should look like. The supervisor needs to know what an ideal lesson looks like, and they have to have their own perceptions on the subject and the content, and unless they have that, there's going to be a disconnect as well. Good supervisors know how to interact with humans and human beings. This is another thing that's easier said than done. The supervisor needs to know what the teacher candidate needs in order to be effective, and what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. You know, going back to the example I presented on myself, if somebody came into my classroom and expected me to be doing RTI in top-notch reading instruction, it wasn't going to happen. If you needed me to do an integrated math system where we were going over graphs and tabling and how that can relate to algebra and geometry, I had it covered. But the reading area, I really didn't when I transitioned into early childhood. So I would hope that a good supervisor knows the strengths and weaknesses and can interact with you on the strengths and weaknesses. For me, I wanted them to see the areas that I had the most weakness in to help me get better, but I can see some people would just want to put on a dog and pony show and show off what they do great. So you have to make sure that the supervisors are trained appropriately. If the district wants this done right, district needs to train in the process and in the procedure that's used. And there has to be a connection to theory that works and theory that doesn't work, and the supervisor has to see it and the supervisor has to understand it. So we've looked at the model, we've talked about it 100 times. Remember that we have a pre-conference, and that's the planning conference in the Sullivan book, observation, a feedback conference, which is post-observation, and teacher reflection. This is what you should be doing. Do all schools do this model? No, they don't have time to do it, but this is what you really should be doing. So the planning conference, when you meet with the teacher beforehand, the main thing that needs to come out in that conference is you talk to the teacher about what is your lesson going to look like? How am I going to be observing you? What's the purpose? I'm going to be looking at who you call on. Did you call on more boys than you call on girls? Are your levels of questioning higher level or lower level? That purpose has to be clearly explained to the teacher beforehand. The supervisor has to be reassuring to the teacher and say, I'm doing this to help you, and they also have to choose an appropriate observation tool when necessary. In that planning conference, you decide the focus of it, you sit down and you show them, this is the form that I'm using, and that is a big idea. They have to see what the form is. If they don't know what the form is, you're going to blindside them. Sure, they probably got it in a professional development meeting at some point, 4 or 5 months ago, but you need to take the time and energy to go back through with them and say, this is how the form's going to be used and this is what it looks like. And then you set up the time of the observation and actual conversation on when they're going to get feedback. And my belief, 48 to 72 hours afterwards. So the teacher really needs to be the one taking the lead and saying what they want the observation to be there. You need to have their perspective on their concerns and their interests. But if you can offer something at the last minute, they can say, well, what if we looked at this way, and the teacher feels confident with it? There's nothing wrong with that, but that has to be something that's mutually agreed upon between supervisor and between teacher. Method and form of observation. The district normally has their own form, but if you've learned one thing about the Sullivan text, they want you to use other forms as well, which is actually why I really like this book. The teacher could have you create a form, but I think that's more work for you. You have now, if you keep any of these books from this class, you have, if I've counted correctly, you have 87 different observation tools. If you're going to sit here and tell me that you can't use one of those 87 observation tools to give a teacher formative feedback, then you are the idiot and shouldn't be going into the principalship, because 87 tools, there has to be at least one or two that you can easily use for an observation, and it gives options. And that's why I like it. The teacher needs to have the opportunity to choose the date and the time. It gives them comfort in their observation. It'll give them the opportunity for feedback. And once they have time, they can focus on their method instead of trying to put on a show. I don't like the approach of just putting on a show. I think that can be a problem as well. So the key steps in the observation process, I'll give you a minute to look over these. These are really, what's the choice of the tool, how do you conduct the observation, how do you verify the meeting afterwards, how do you analyze the facts, and how do you think about the feedback conversation as well. So finalizing the tool, my advice to you, this is me being cynical, but it's important. You put this in writing and you put this in email. This protects you, and it lets the teachers know for sure what method and form you're using. It could be a district tool, or it could be one that you borrowed, or it could be something completely different, but you should put it in writing. I am using Sullivan tool number 6, as we discussed in our meeting. It protects you, and the teachers know the method. Then you conduct the observation. I don't have anything to say here. We've covered this entire class, but don't make conclusions. Focus on what is happening and save the conclusions for later. Verify the feedback and offer a copy of the observation tool to the teacher before the conversation happens. Tell the teacher when the feedback conversation is going to happen, when it's going to occur. And then if the supervisor has an observation tool filled out completely, give it to the teacher beforehand so they know it's coming and they can at least respond to it, and you can discuss it as part of the conversation. Think of interpretations. If you have the opportunity, really talk about after the class is over, really think about how the observation went. That way it's fresh in their minds. And don't jump to final conclusions before meeting with the teacher. Remember to get the teacher's perspective, but the observation really is for you to gather ideas and then you get feedback. This is where Glickman comes into play. You know if the observation went good or not. That's when you decide whether or not you're going to take the lead and go in a particular direction and how the feedback conversation is going to look. If the observation doesn't go well, you need to have a contingency plan, and the teacher needs to be on board with you for that plan as well. So I'm not going to overlap the Glickman model. I'm not going to waste my time on it. You already know the model, so don't overly cover it and don't overly rely on it. Collaborative reflection. Think about the value of the supervision cycle. Do this at the end of the feedback conversation or at a scheduled time after the conversation. Ask the questions: what went well, what needs improvement, what would you do differently? That lets the teacher know that you're looking at ways for continuous improvement and you're reflecting on each other. So that's it. The next chapter, honestly, there's a lot of content to it, but I'm only going to touch upon it. But look, we're going to look at these different models: the peer coaching model, action research, critical friends, instructional rounds, which is the point of the Catcher book. But figure out what model of supervision works best for you and how it relates. Thank you.